Welcome to Chapter 3, which is what I like to talk about logical fallacies, but I like to call it everything that's wrong with Twitter. I will use Twitter a lot in these examples, so I apologize in advance. If you are not a Twitter user, you might not appreciate some of my jokes. Okay, here we go. We're going to cover sections 1 through 4. Every single section is just more and more fallacies. So this is literally doing it all in one huge clump, kind of makes the most sense. So here we go. Fallacies are where it looks like you're trying to make a good argument, but what you're doing is actually making a bad argument. And I'll just give you some examples. We're going to go. Formal fallacies are fallacies that occur when you don't fit a form. So like if you're trying to fit the syllogism, all A are B, all C are B, therefore all A are C. Okay. If you're trying to fit that form, but you don't, you make a fallacy when you are trying to do that. That is called a formal fallacy. Informal fallacies are things that you can actually pick out based on what they are. So like this example, the Brooklyn Bridge is made of atoms. Atoms are invisible. Therefore, the Brooklyn Bridge is invisible. Okay, obviously the Brooklyn Bridge is not invisible. And atoms technically aren't invisible. They can be seen, just not with the naked eye, that's all. There are also logical irrelevance and psychological relevance. So like the conclusion seems to follow from the premises, even though it doesn't follow logically. So somebody might be using premises that they think seems to follow and lead toward that conclusion, but they actually don't. So there's lots of things that could happen in different arguments. But there are a bunch of very specific fallacies of relevance, and these are the ones we kind of want to focus on. So there's one that's called an appeal to force. And this is where you will threaten someone. Like, if you don't agree with me, then I think you should get thrown in prison. Okay, those are the kind, I hear those. I hear that a lot on Twitter. So that's the kind of thing where you're threatening the well-being of the listener or the reader or an individual or a group or whoever. So that's called an appeal to force. There's an appeal to pity, and that one's another very common emotional plea that people use when arguing. If you don't believe in abortion, then you just hate women, or you don't believe in women's rights, or you don't, something to that effect. So that you'll get appeal to pity a lot, where you're trying to draw the arguer into some emotional, like, feel sorry for me, I'm the victim kind of thing. You can have an appeal to people. That would be direct or indirect. So the arguer uses the other person's desire for love or acceptance or value or, whatever, some kind of similar emotional response from them. The direct approach occurs when the arguer addresses a large group and excites them and gets them, all enthusiastic. And an indirect approach is just more when you're putting it towards one person or maybe a small group of people, and trying to get them to move on to that. So lots of different fallacies. Arguments against the person. This one is very, very common on Twitter. Ad hominem, there's abusive, and then there's circumstantial. So you can say, oh, well, you can't believe anything Trump says because he's being indicted. Well, you could indict a ham sandwich, according to a lawyer, a very famous lawyer. So that's a circumstantial thing. Just because someone is going through a trouble in some other area of their life doesn't mean that they're wrong. An ad hominem of abusive, very common on Twitter. Like, you're a moron, you're an idiot. Very, very basic ad hominem attack. All right, then you've got the tukeku, which I, of course, can't speak Latin, so please don't make fun of me. This is where you have two arguers. So I'm going to call argue A and arguer 2, okay? So one presents their argument. The second one rejects that argument and verbally attacks the other person at the same time. And again, these are usually in bad faith, and there's a lot of bad faith argument that happens on Twitter. So just please know that on Twitter, you're not going to get a good debate, and you're going to find that a lot of people need to take a logic class. So, all right, next one, an accident. It's where you misapply. This is a fallacy that when you apply a rule, but you apply it wrong. And usually you don't intend to do it. It's very, it's a misintentional. So you're not doing it on purpose, but still that's why they call it an accident, because you didn't mean to do it. You didn't do it on purpose. A straw man. Oh, this is another very famous one. This is a fallacy that's committed when the arguer distorts the opponent's argument for the purpose of attacking it more easily. So like I just had this happen to me recently on Twitter where I was discussing, I'm going to use that word discussing very loosely, with another user about abortion, because they just had a big, Ohio just passed a bill that had to do with abortion. Anyway, we were discussing that bill, and I said, well, that's kind of interesting because the majority of Americans actually believe that abortion should be limited or banned. And then he immediately came back, well, oh, you're just wrong because you think that the Americans want to ban it. I said, well, that's not what I said. I said they want to limit or ban. So that's a straw man, right? He changed my argument so that he could claim he won, because we all know that the majority of Americans don't want to ban abortion. Every poll has shown that. So he had to change my argument so that he could win, and that's a straw man. Missing the point. Well, I think this one's pretty straightforward. When someone completely misses the point and then changes the argument to something else and goes on. Yeah, missing the point is very, very well named, because that's what that little GIF is that I use on Twitter all the time with the airplane flying over somebody's head. All right, a red herring. This is another famous one. That's when the arguer diverts the attention of the reader or listener by completely changing the subject to something different. Like you're discussing abortion and you change the subject. They change the subject to organ donation. Not even the same subject. Can't even apply those two things to each other. So red herrings where people try to, deflect or drop you off track in some way. Relevant but weak premises. So you may be using premises, but there's really no logical connection between them, and they're really not strong to support the conclusions. There are also specific fallacies of weak induction, where you appeal to an unqualified authority. And this happens a lot. Okay. If you that's like citing a doctor who doesn't do any work with heart patients. Maybe he's an OBGYN, and then you're citing him to say something about, your COVID-19 vaccine. All right, well, what's an OBGYN? They don't have anything to do with vaccines, and they're not, that isn't their field of study. So make sure that you're appealing to the qualified authority, not the unqualified authority. Appeal to ignorance. Oh, this is one that's just pervasive on social media. This occurs when nobody has proved your premise is true, but you're just 100% sure. Like, this is why I usually tell people when they make these claims, like, where's your source for that claim? Because I've never heard that. And then if they say, oh, well, go Google it yourself. Okay. They are making an appeal to ignorance. They have not proven their premise. Nobody has proven that it's true. So you automatically assume their conclusion is false when they do that. Hasty generalizations. This one kind of makes sense. When you make a generalization about a whole group, instead of just so that specific case might not be representative of the whole group, right? So just be careful about making those kind of generalizations as a rule. All right, there's the false cause. This is a fallacy that occurs when there's a link, when the link between the premises and the conclusion depends on some imagined causal connection, right? Correlation is not causation. That's where that famous line comes from. Just because two things are happening together, like, for example, if you were to look at data, and you can Google it if you want to, I'm not lying, that there is a correlation between the number of Nicolas Cage films put out every year and the number of people who drown in swimming pools. So the years that Nicolas Cage puts out more movies, more people were drowning in swimming pools. Now, does that mean that there's a connection, that there is a causal relationship between those two things? Absolutely not. So be careful of your false cause fallacy. There's post hoc ergo propter hoc. This is a fallacy that, again, you don't have to speak Latin. Okay. This is just a fallacy that presupposes that just because one event happened before the second event, that the first event somehow caused the second event. Sometimes things are not related. Just because they happened in that order doesn't mean that it happened because of that. And if you're really into like crime novels, this is one that, because a lot of people will just assume, oh, well, this happened and then she was murdered, so that had to be a relationship. It could have been completely just random that she did that one thing and then was murdered the next day. Okay, so be careful of those kind of things. Non causa pro causa. This is a fallacy that's committed when taken to be the cause of something is not really the cause at all, and that this mistake is based on something other than a mere temporal succession. So again, kind of the same thing, but this is where it did cause it, and you don't believe that it was caused by that. So again, maybe her taking the bus was the reason that she got killed. We don't know. Okay, so be careful of those things. Oversimplified causes. This occurs when a multitude of different causes are responsible for a certain effect, but the arguer selects just one of them. So like, and again, I like to use crime because I don't know, because I'm addicted to A&E because it's weird. I don't know. I like crime dramas. So if you have, if there's someone involved in gang activity and then they get murdered, right? Well, you can just say, oh, it was the drugs that killed him. Well, it might not have been. Like, gangs do a lot of shady activity, so it might have been the drugs. It might have been he disrespected some other gang member. It might have been. So there's a lot of, can't really oversimplify the cause sometimes. Sometimes there's multiple factors. Then there's the gambler's fallacy. And this is committed whenever the conclusion of an argument depends on the supposition that independent events in a game of chance are causally related. They are not. If the true definition of an independent event in statistics class is that they have no relationship to each other. So if you're just assuming, that's where the gamblers are like, oh, I didn't win because you took my ace or you took my king. Like, that has nothing. That was totally an independent event, and they didn't take anything. It's just a game of chance. So there is no causal relationship in games of chance. Hence the reason they call it a gambler's fallacy. Slippery slope. Oh, this is another famous one. Okay, slippery slope is a variety of false cause faculties. It occurs when the conclusion of an argument rests on an alleged chain reaction, for which there is insufficient reason to think that will actually take place. And unfortunately, these slippery slopes, if you look back in history, we are finding that there actually is a reason. Once you get, hindsight is always 2020. So just remember that. So like back in the 80s, I remember, the Tipper Gore had this big campaign to put the warning labels on CDs and cassettes that had music that had questionable lyrics. And they kept saying, oh, well, this slippery slope. If we allow people to say bad words now in the music, and, the next thing we're going to have, women with no clothes on running around on stage singing to our children about sexual blah, blah, blah. And of course, we all thought they were just over exaggerating. Well, unfortunately, that's actually come to pass, ladies and gentlemen. So beware. Those slippery slopes do actually occur. But you can only talk about them in hindsight. You can't talk about them in the future tense because you can't predict the future. So a weak analogy, that one's kind of pretty straightforward. This affects inductive arguments from analogies where you're trying to say something is like something else, but there's really no strong enough conclusion to support that. All right, then we move into section 4, and I haven't been going over the sections title by title, but you guys can all read, so I'm not worried about that. There's fallacies of presumption. Where you assume something that needs to be proven. So like the fallacy of begging the question. That's committed when the arguer is creating this illusion that all of these premises that they give that are inadequate are somehow providing support for their conclusion. Okay, so again, begging the question, and this is something that police officers often do. Like, if they don't have evidence to prove that you are trying to commit a crime and they call you in for questioning, and they'll keep asking you questions over and over again, but they'll be very leading questions to try and get you. So they're going to be begging the question with you. Lawyers are fabulous at this if they're cross-examining people on the stand. So when did you stop beating your wife? Okay, well, that implies that you were beating your wife to begin with, right? So it's a shaky premise. You don't have any proof that the person was beating their wife in the first place. So again, begging the question, very important. Complex questions. This is committed when 2 or more questions are asked in the guise of a single question. And a lot of people will try to say, oh, well, that's a complex question. You're arguing in bad faith because you're not giving me one question. Well, a lot of times there is one question. People will try to tell you it's a complex question and that you're committing this fallacy to throw you off guard. And that there has to be a single answer to both of those questions that you're asking. So just be careful when you're especially during debate, that your questions are very pointed and they don't have multiple parts. You want to be very, very straightforward with your questioning. False dichotomy. Oh, this one all the time. Either you believe in this or you're a fascist. Oh, I hear that all the time. Okay, that is a false dichotomy. It's not an either or situation. Right? And I'm going to talk about the abortion debate just because it's something that's such a hot topic right now. Okay? This is not an all or nothing. This isn't a sum total or loss. Okay? There are there's very varying cases, different laws, different time limits, different everything. This is not you have to have abortion legal all 9 months, no matter what, or you have to ban it. Like, again, we all know that that's a very false dichotomy. We know that every state has their own rules. I live in Florida. Our law here is 8 weeks. Other weeks, like in Europe, very common to be between 12 and 15 weeks is the limit. After that, you have to get special permission. So don't create those false dichotomies, right? Make sure that you realize that there are some options. There is something called suppressed evidence. This is a fallacy that occurs when an inductive argument, again, this is all inductive, the arguer ignores important evidence. Like, I will give you a great example of suppressed evidence. Like when you have a case where George Floyd died in police custody, and they want to say the police killed him, but yet people ignore the fact that he had, lethal levels of fentanyl in his system and multiple levels of fentanyl and multiple different drugs in his system, which makes, when you mix illicit drugs, that makes their effects even greater. So you don't even need as much of the drug to kill you. So when you suppress evidence like that, that's a very important fallacy. Like you have to make sure that you are not suppressing evidence, that you are not keeping any, you're not ignoring those things. You're presenting all evidence that will support your conclusion. So if you tell me he died in police custody and he was, suffocated to death, then I'm going to expect to see trauma. Well, there was no trauma and he had lethal doses. So based on that suppressed evidence, I would say, I think maybe the drugs killed him. But, that's where politics start, and that's where things get ugly, because we all know there is no logic in politics, right? Politics is just one fallacy after another. All right, there are fallacies of ambiguity, and these rely upon shifts in meaning between the premise and the conclusion. So you have to make sure that the words that you are using in a debate, that everyone has the same definition of them. And this is another thing that a lot of, people, when they argue on Twitter, like to say, oh, well, that's not what that word means. Like, you can't change the definition of words. If you change the definition of a word, then that means that definitions are no longer necessary, and words can just mean whatever they want. So we have to make sure that we're all using those same definitions. There's evocation. I can never say this word. Evocation. There we go. Welcome to my life. This fallacy occurs when the conclusion of an argument depends on the fact that a word or phrase, used explicitly or implicitly, is used in two different senses in an argument. Because we all know that words can have different meanings. So again, you might be using one definition of that word and somebody else might be using another. So please make sure that you're all on the same page and that you agree to those definitions. Amphiboly, this is a fallacy that is committed when the arguer misinterprets an ambiguous statement and then draws a conclusion based on that misinterpretation. So please, you got to make sure that you're very clear, no ambiguous statements. The fallacy of illicit transference. There's a bunch of these, and these are all fallacies that rely on deceptive similarity in linguistic structure. And so we'll talk about some of those. The first one is called composition. So this is a fallacy that is committed when the conclusion of an argument depends on this erroneous transfer of an attribute from the parts to the whole. Okay, so just because a gang member in Chicago did this and he was black doesn't mean that a black guy who lives in the suburbs of, Houston is going to be doing the same thing. Okay, you can't, the parts are not the whole. Okay, you can't make, it's more of a, it's composition, but it can also fall under a couple different categories. So remember, the parts are not the whole. Division. This is the fallacy, which is the exact reverse, where you go from the whole to the parts, where you try to say, all black people have to think this way. Like Joe Biden did this when if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Okay, that was a huge fallacy of division. Okay, so again, politics. Great examples. And I've actually in your course resources, I have a link to a nice article in a newspaper that talked about the fallacies in politics. So I think you guys will like that. All right, so guess the fallacy. All right, so there are, I think, 8 or 9 of these fallacies. So I'd like you to read these 5, press pause, read these 5, and then try to figure out which fallacy it is. All right, and then here's the next 3. I guess there's 8. So press pause, see if you can figure them out. And now that you've had a chance, we are going to give you the answers. Then again, this just takes practice. So don't feel like if you got them all wrong, it's okay. Like you're just getting started. You're going to study. You're going to do some homework. You're going to try some examples. So here are, I love alphabet soup. Alphabet soup is my favorite, kind of where everybody uses the buzzwords of the day. I work in education, so that's a very very common fallacy in my world. All right, so I hope you enjoyed your fallacies. Please, I have on course resources put up an entire dictionary, I think of like 100 and something different fallacies. So if you're bored and need something to read, there's a whole bunch of fallacies for you to go look at. They're all in alphabetical order. So again, just look at all the resources that I have posted, and I'll see you next time.